Welcome to the Mississippi State University College of Business Family Business Education Initiative responding to COVID-19. That's a long title, but it's important information. And today's session is especially important because it deals with human resource issues and COVID-19. And here to talk about that is Dr. Laura Marler, and good to have you here. This might be one of the bigger topics we tackle in this series.
Absolutely.
HR is always a sticky wicket at best with the COVID in there. It's just, it's got a lot of folks scrambling. You're going to tell us some do's and don'ts and give us an overview of what you're going to talk about today.
Okay, so a couple of things that we can talk about are just the general impact on the workplace that COVID-19 has had. And I think it's been a challenge for everyone in HR, but I think it's particularly challenging for small businesses where the person that wears the HR hat also wears a lot of other hats. There may not be one person devoted to HR. So I feel like it's been very challenging for small businesses to navigate this. So today, some of the things we can talk about that could be helpful to them are how to face difficult staffing decisions, layoffs, furloughs. We'll talk about other laws that need to be considered and kept in mind when you're making those decisions and other decisions. We're going to also talk about some common questions that many companies are facing, such as how do we deal with an employee that's reluctant to return to work? Also, we'll finish up with a few tips on best practices moving forward.
Well, and HR, for those of us that aren't practitioners, just seems like there's so many regulations and so many rules. COVID has actually added to that, sort of piled on. So what's the impact it's had on the workplace?
Absolutely. It's had a very big impact because small businesses, well, all businesses, but small businesses in particular, are facing new legal requirements. And what that means is it's created the need for new policy for these businesses. Also, they're facing financial pressure, and HR also is in charge of attracting and retaining talent. So they're having to manage a lot at one time. Specifically, some difficult issues surrounding COVID-19 are the staffing issues. When firms financially are faced with this situation, they are having to decide, are we going to do furloughs? Are we going to do layoffs? What do we do when employees don't want to return? So those are just a couple of the things that they're facing. One of the ways that companies have dealt with this is through pay cuts. And that is something that, of course, is not usually received well, right? But a pay cut could enable you to maintain your workforce and keep your workforce and keep them with benefits. A couple of things to keep in mind if you're making a decision for a pay cut. You want to carefully consider which groups receive pay cuts. So, for example, if you have several units in your organization and one unit happens to be predominantly female and that unit happens to receive the pay cuts and the other units don't, you may have some legal exposure there. So you need to carefully think through where the pay cuts will be and who and what groups they'll be impacting. Another alternative to a pay cut is a reduction in hours. So if you have people who are hourly employees, you can reduce their hours, and that way they're not off your, they're still an employee, they're not off your books completely, and it's just more of a cutback of hours, and hopefully you could, when things get better, bring them back and have more hours. Something else to keep in mind if you do pay cuts is to avoid a retroactive pay cut. And that seems like something that would be simple. Obviously, we're not going to go back and dock your previous time. However, if you make that pay cut decision during a pay cut period, you need to be careful that it doesn't affect the previous part of the period before you made that decision.
Sure.
So with that in mind, I think it's really good to notify your employees in advance and have open communication with them so they know what to expect, and let them know why you're making these decisions.
And then how does that compare with a furlough?
So a furlough is really just asking employees or requiring them to take unpaid leave. And a lot of times we think of this as, okay, we're furloughing everyone for 2 weeks all at the same time. And that's not necessarily the case. Furloughs can be staggered, so you can have some groups take them. Some groups would take unpaid leave at one point, and another unit or group would take it at, a different time. Or you could reduce work hours as well. The benefit of a furlough is that you can continue to provide these employees with benefits, which would be contrasted with a layoff where you would not be able to do so. Also, with COVID-19, there's been some changes in unemployment benefits. And so depending upon your state, unemployment could still apply in the case of a furlough.
Okay, and layoffs, again, there's a difference between the two.
Absolutely. So a layoff is a reduction in your workforce, typically to reduce your expenses and improve your bottom line. When you have a layoff, there's no cause from the employee, so typically they're going to be eligible for unemployment, so that's something to keep in mind. Also, something to keep in mind is that they can be rehired at a later point in time. Again, discrimination or legal exposure could be a concern. Carefully think about any groups that you're going to lay off, and just be mindful of that moving forward.
Well, and there are also some laws and some new laws that have to be taken into consideration with this, right?
Absolutely, and this is where things get a little bit complicated. So the FFCRA, Families First Corona Response Act, what this act does is it expands family and medical leave. And it really is in two parts. So you can have leave for yourself, and you can also have leave if you're a caretaker. It can apply to part-time and full-time employees. Also, something that's different from your Family and Medical Leave Act, which this is an expansion of that act, that act typically applies and gives leave to employees who've been there at least a year, and it's unpaid leave. Under the FFCRA, leave will not depend on how long their length of employment is. So it applies to full-time, part-time, and you don't have to meet the normal benchmark for FMLA leave.
Okay. All right, so in addition to all that, right, then you still have, there's some child care things involved and...
Absolutely. So under this leave, you could... basically, you need to give leave if an employee is sick and has to be quarantined, or if they've been exposed and they have to be quarantined, and so they would get paid leave. Also, there's child care leave if for some reason someone's child care provider is not available. A lot of child care providers are closed right now. This leave takes care of that and offers some paid leave for that. Now, there is an important child care exemption to note for small businesses. If you have fewer than 50 employees, it could apply to you. Something to keep in mind, this is not a blanket exemption. It only happens if under basically 3 conditions. If this person leaves due to child care problems, if it puts your business in jeopardy of survival, then that would make you exempt from having to offer it. If this person is a key employee, if they are someone who is performing a function that no one else can perform, so for example, if you have one person doing your payroll, then you really need that person there, and if no one else is trained to do it, that person would be considered a key employee. Finally, if you are not able to operate at minimal capacity for your business to function, and if that person leaving would cause you to dip below your minimal capacity, you would also fall into the exception.
Right. So what if you have employees with disabilities?
Well, and that is going to get into the issue of accommodation, and we'll talk about that. The Americans with Disabilities Act applies to employers with 15 or more employees, and it protects individuals working for you or job applicants with disabilities. Typically, it requires reasonable accommodation, and that is based on the cost of the accommodation and the resources of the employer. One exception would be if it places undue hardship on the employer. So many small businesses may have a few more than 15, so ADA applies, but there could be some cases where it's very difficult for them to provide extended leave for employees. But we'll talk about some options for flexibility more when we get to kind of best practices at the end.
All right, so you've made those tough decisions as a business owner to lay off, furlough, whatever. Things are starting to look better, and so you call your employees and you say, come on back. And they say, nah.
Exactly. So employers are excited to have employees returning to work. However, some employees may be a little bit reluctant to return. So one question that's common is, can employees be required to return to work? Yes, in most cases. If there are federal, state, local restrictions, obviously if you have a stay-at-home order, you're not allowed to bring those employees back. But assuming those restrictions have been lifted, you can require your employees to return to work. And in fact, some employees have implemented laws that actually limit your liability when you do bring those employees back. Now, you do still need to think about who should be accommodated. Mm-hmm. And under the ADA, there may be people who do need accommodation. Examples would be a compromised immune system, or if you have caregiving responsibilities. So you really need to keep in mind each person's situation.
All right, so what if you have some folks who are reluctant to come back to work? How do you handle that ethically and legally?
Absolutely. That's an important issue, and one that can be a little bit difficult to navigate. So the first thing I would encourage employers to do is really demonstrate understanding and empathy for that person, because it is difficult for them. And really try to open up a dialogue with them, ask for and document a reason as to why they feel uncomfortable returning. And then once you've started a dialogue, that's a great opportunity to discuss if you have a safe return to work plan, which many organizations have invested a lot of time and energy into that. So that could alleviate some of their concerns. Also, something to think about is being flexible. Can they work from home? Do they have other leave options, or are you obligated to make accommodations? So there are a couple of things to think about before just telling them you must return. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, a refusal to return could be considered resignation, and it could affect unemployment benefits in some cases. So that is something that you would need to let the employee know and provide them with that information so that they can make an informed decision for themselves.
So it's got to be tough. If you're an employer, you have a business and you're really good at making widgets, right? That's your thing. That doesn't necessarily translate into creating a workplace that's safe for combating the coronavirus, right? So are there resources out? How does an employer do that?
Right. It can be very challenging, and there are a lot of resources out there. So first of all, I would say be prepared for employees to have questions and concerns, okay? They will. And one of the things that you can do to help alleviate those concerns and provide your employees with answers is create a safe return to work guide. Let them know about what you'll be doing in terms of screening and testing. Let them know about your social distancing and any face covering requirements that you might have. Let them know about your revised policies, especially those related to leave and the FFCRA. Also, think about your work from home policies and accommodations. And sometimes if you give employees that information, it can help create a situation where they do feel more comfortable returning and they know that you are taking this seriously. Many employers are turning to the Centers for Disease Control to get guidance on how to handle these situations. So that is one resource, cdc.gov, that employers can go to and get specific advice for how to handle this in the workplace.
All right, so even the experts disagree on the best way to handle social distancing and wearing a mask and not wearing a mask. So what leeway does an employer have with the employees on those issues?
Right. So the employer does have some flexibility. I think the reason that many employers are turning to the CDC is that at least it's providing something that's standard and it is being updated from time to time. And so that way they can say, we are turning to this source of advice. So a lot of the employers I've talked to, large and small, are using that for guidance. So you can require social distancing, you can require face coverings. Now keep in mind, some people may have a problem that prevents them from wearing a face covering. So you would need to take into account some of those situations. For example, if someone has asthma, you might want to consider, is that appropriate for them? Is there a work from home option? So something else to keep in mind, though, is unless there is a federal, state, or local order, you're not necessarily required to implement these changes. So it depends on the law. And that's a big burden for employers, but you're responsible as an employer for staying up to date on what the laws are in your area. It doesn't matter if you know the law or not, you'll be held accountable. So I would encourage employers to try to seek out advice. There's a lot out on the web that you can look at. You can look at your state's Department of Labor. You can look at your state's unemployment website, and you can go to the cdc.gov. Also, something to keep in mind, and this is really with any HR policy, the more you can get employee buy-in, the easier it is to implement that policy. Mm-hmm. So if you can have an open dialogue with your employees and communicate with them and let them know, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, and we're trying to provide a safe work environment for you, I think it can be easier to get compliance on the employee side if they understand your goals and your obligations as an employer to provide a safe workplace.
Well, and we're seeing more and more, no matter what precautions you take, there's still a good chance that sooner or later the virus shows up in the workplace. So how does an employer handle that?
That can be very challenging. And I would encourage businesses to go ahead and have a plan for this. You really need to think about what happens if one of your employees is exposed to COVID-19 or if they have COVID-19, if they are in a situation where they need to be quarantined. It would be a good idea to go ahead and have a policy that tells them you need to immediately contact your supervisor, you need to stay home until you can get testing and get cleared. So whatever your policies are, you need to let them know and probably have that plan in advance before this problem arises, because like you said, it's highly likely that it will. And also think about, what will the supervisor's obligation be? Will they need to decide who has that person been working around? Were they socially distanced in the department, or is it a situation where the whole department may need to be quarantined? And then you've got to think about it from the organizational level. Will the organization come in and sanitize a certain area? So I would really encourage employers to kind of think about this on the front end, especially now that we have a lot of people returning to work. It might be worth a little time investment now so that you have a plan if this does arise.
All right, so we have covered a lot of ground, and I think as a service to those who might be watching, let's go ahead and hit some of the best practices that they might want to implement.
Absolutely. So one of the things that a lot of employers are doing, and I would encourage small employers in particular to do this, is really revisit your HR policies. now is the time where you're going to need to update them anyway for new federal leave requirements. And also think about all of your leave policies. Think about your work from home and your telework policies. You know, is there a certain type of equipment your employee could use and work from home and perform the job in the same way? I've talked to a lot of small employers, and it's been really interesting to hear their stories about, wow, we didn't think this employee would be able to do this job from home, but they're actually doing a phenomenal job, and all we had to do was provide them with some technical setup, basically. So there's a lot that you can rethink at this point, and it might be a good idea, because if this is something we face long term, it might be a good idea to invest a little bit in, you know, what it looks like to work from home, and how you manage those employees, which, you know, that will look a little bit different. Also, something else I would encourage employers to do is have a centralized way for employees to get information about COVID-19 and your response. One thought would be, you know, could you have a COVID-19 coordinator? One person that handles the questions. I know at Mississippi State we have a lot of resources, but at the end of the day, there's one phone number we could all call if we had questions. You could have this information on a website, or you could put one person in charge of this. So think about how your employees will access this information. Not every employee has a computer at home where they're checking email and regularly checking your website updates. So think about how they'll get access to that information. That's something that I think, again, if you put a little time into this in advance, it's going to help you deal with it better. And also think about, how will you handle employee questions when they arise? Sometimes you may not have answers, but maintaining that open dialogue, I think, is very important during this time where we do have a very fluid situation.
And with that fluidity, you're going to see folks in and out of the office. Some folks may be out for an extended period of time. So if you're an employer, how best to prepare for that?
Well, and you need to think about who is essential to have in the office. Who are those key employees that you cannot function without? But one thing you can do is think about, in a case of high absenteeism, you know, what are you going to do if that did happen? One thing you can do in advance is cross-train your employees. So for example, payroll is such an important function, and it often falls under HR. A lot of employers will outsource it, but a lot of small employers do not. So you might want to train multiple people in your organization to be able to perform that function or other essential functions. So cross-training can be a great solution. Also, work from home, like we talked about, can be another great solution.
If folks need more information, well, they just reach out to you.
Absolutely. You can contact me via email, lmarler@business.mstate.edu, and I'll be happy to provide any information I have or direct you to resources that I'm aware of.
Well, we certainly appreciate this. Has been a lot of useful information, and we know a lot of businesses are trying to tackle these very issues. So thank you for your time and your expertise, and we hope you have found this part of the series useful for your business, and we appreciate you joining us.
Thank you for having me.